Hey class, thanks for tuning in. I want in this video to give an overview of the third frame, the political frame, to get you introduced to concepts as well as thinking through how to lead and influence people effectively by becoming an advocate and a negotiator. So the first two frames I mentioned in class on WebEx on Thursday. The structural and the human resource frames are the two frames used most often in everyday management. These are kind of the nuts and bolts and the go-to frames that we typically use to solve problems in everyday life. These next two frames, while they may be used less often than the human resource and the structural frames, the political frame and the symbolic frame can be more impactful and even can make a bigger difference if they're used well and appropriately timed. And as we'll see, the time to use the political frame and the symbolic frame is when life gets complex, or when the internal or external environment that you operate in is unpredictable or rapidly changing. These are times when you as the leader might think about reality in the political frame and in the structural frame. So how do we think about reality in the political frame? To me, it helps to see the political frame as essentially a realistic view of reality rather than an overly optimistic or pessimistic. It sees life on a team or in an organization maybe the most clearly. And the story it tells is that resources are scarce. And while people are interdependent, in other words, people need each other in order to make decisions and to accomplish goals, essentially there's not enough resources to go around, and that introduces a concept of negotiation and allocation of these resources. So the story the political frame tells is of life as being essentially an arena or a jungle where people struggle in order to secure the resources they need to accomplish their goals. And this struggle can occur internally, where let's say one team in an athletics department struggles to gain financial resources from another team that competes in the same athletics department. So the struggle can be internal or external, where the same athletic team might compete externally with another team for the resources of a conference. Or even, for example, something I'll talk about in a few slides, let's say the women's U.S. soccer team and the men's U.S. soccer team. As many of you know, the women's team just issued a lawsuit against the U.S. Sports Federation on the basis of discrimination in pay based on gender. So in this case, even though the women's team and the men's U.S. soccer teams are very friendly and mutually respectful, they are essentially competing with each other and engaged in a friendly competition for scarce resources from U.S. soccer and even from the larger FIFA organization that governs international soccer as a whole. So then again, you see that the political frame views organizations as jungles, where most decisions involve allocating scarce resources by effective leaders, and the effective leader is an advocate who can defend the team they lead and negotiate on behalf of the people they lead in order to accomplish the goals and meet the needs of those that they lead. So this is a slide that you've seen before, and I'll introduce it from now on and use it as a reminder. But this is what it looks like, not only to think from the perspective of a certain frame, but to be effective or ineffective when operating in that. So you can see here the power button graphic is highlighted in this frame because I think your book does a good job of essentially visually demonstrating that the political frame is all about the effective use of power. So as we'll see here, the political leader, when operating effectively and using power appropriately and ethically, is an advocate and a negotiator who uses coalition building in order to accomplish the goals and to advocate for the teams they lead. Whereas the ineffective leader, essentially who misuses power, can be viewed as a manipulator and a fraud who essentially acts as a con artist, or even worse, a thug who throws power around and might use power unethically to serve their own self-interest rather than the needs of those they lead, or even to take advantage of people or to coerce people into doing things that they wouldn't willingly do. In other words, rather than being a servant of their organization by advocating appropriately, the ineffective political leader can look like either a manipulative con artist or even worse, a thug. So let's spend a few slides just talking about how to think about the political frame as a leader, and then we'll move into actually tools and skills that you can use to be effective in the political frame. But for some of us, this frame, more than the others, can be one that we are more resistant to view reality in, let alone work on operating in and making decisions in. So let's remind ourselves again that the political frame ultimately tries to see reality realistically and says, look, oftentimes power and this struggle and negotiation and give and take that occurs between people in relationships and between organizations, this power and this interaction actually produces the type of reality that a team or an organization or a group of people will experience. So the question for us as people within organizations and on teams, whether they're sports teams or universities or wherever we find ourselves, if we're all interdependent and if there's not enough resources to go around, then the question is not whether we will have politics and a struggle for power, but rather what kind of politics we will have. So let's relate this idea of power back to the frames we've covered so far. So you'll see that power is a part or is relevant to the structural and the human resource frame, but it's not central. And now in the political frame, power becomes directly central to the leader's effectiveness. In the structural frame, you'll remember even with the Mintzberg 5 models, you saw that often authorities used power to establish structure. And they did that hopefully through effective design and by being good architects. But yet they primarily organized in order to produce efficiency in the workplace and accomplishment of the goals, but then that had a secondary outcome of limiting conflict, of actually reducing the struggle for scarce resources because people were being efficient in accomplishing those goals. For example, just think about a sports team that's cruising along on a winning streak and everybody's playing well together and things are going well. On a team like that, power struggles can tend to be minimized. People are happy, the structure is working, and because of that, conflict is limited. So also with the human resource frame. This frame, you'll remember, emphasizes empowerment from the leader who effectively aligns the needs of individuals with the needs of the organization. And when people feel empowered, and there's a good fit, then that family, whether it's a sports team or a larger organization, that family conflict is minimized because power is effectively used as people are feeling that their needs are being met. Finally, one more way of preparing ourselves to think through the political frame is to recognize some potentially ineffective political assumptions we have. So it can help to look at these and read these assumptions in contrast to a realistic view of organizational life. Notice the potential cynicism or even pessimism involved in some of these statements. All politics are bad politics, or if people view me as political, then I lose influence over them and they see me as manipulative. Or the middle one, if my decision or action is correct, I shouldn't need to play politics. Many of us might view the political frame and and politics in general in these ways. And your book would say, and I would tend to agree, that these sorts of assumptions, keeping them as you lead people, could make you less effective in the political frame. More helpful would be to read this take-home message that effective managers need to learn to act as politicians in order to deal appropriately with conflict. And I'll always add, serve your people in a way that allows you to advocate for them. So spinning those ineffective statements into the positive, the challenge is for us, each of us, to see leadership in the political frame as an opportunity to actually serve those that we seek to influence. I just saw this tweet today by Simon Sinek. He's kind of a thought leader in the business world right now. He's a journalism and communication faculty member out of Columbia, but he's written a couple of books that I'll reference every now and then. But for those of you, if you haven't chosen a media review book, anything by Simon Sinek would be fair game as well as interesting for you. He just tweeted today, leadership is not a rank or a position to be attained. Leadership is a service to be given. And I would say, and your textbook gives all kinds of examples where advocating well for people by building coalitions and understanding the political environment in which you exist can actually allow you to serve the people that you lead. And if we can capture this idea that leadership in the political frame can actually lead to service, this might help some of us who are resistant to using and thinking about life in this frame to be a little more open to it, to consider that maybe our resistance to using this frame, if we have resistance, comes more from witnessing and being a part of teams where leaders have used it ineffectively or even unethically, rather than that this is an unnecessary way that we should lead. So even for the Christian in the room, I would say, think about even Jesus's command on Last Supper. So the night before he's arrested and then later killed, he's giving his closest friends and followers instructions for how to live and how to lead when he's gone. So he says, you've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around, how quickly a little power goes to their heads. Not so with you. Whoever wants to be great, meaning a great leader, must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your bonded servant, or that's a Greek word essentially for slave. So this idea Jesus is promoting is that leadership is essentially service and advocating for people who need it, people who have less power, people who might benefit from us as leaders using our influence to negotiate well for them. So even all throughout the stories that Jesus told, we call them parables. Jesus is talking about using our resources in a shrewd way or a discerning way, and advocating for people who can't advocate for themselves. In other words, pretty consistently, Jesus is telling his followers to be political, essentially to advocate for those who need us to advocate for them. So enough. Hopefully I've convinced most of us at least to consider any biases or negative assumptions we might have about this frame, whereas other frames I don't have to do that as much because most of us connect pretty well with them. The political frame can take some getting used to, but once we are ready to see reality in this way, then it becomes a useful way to diagnose what's going on in our teams and in our organizations, and to work on shared goals to minimize conflict and to get the resources that people need to accomplish the goals that they want. The political frame then sees organizations as essentially collections of diverse people, and diversity is something that we seek after, whether it's a diversity of talent among our players on a sports team, or diversity of teachers in our school district, or diversity of creative types on a sport marketing board. Diversity is something we want, and yet the more diversity we have, the more differences of potential opinion are possible. And the more coalitions or groups of members with common needs, that's what a coalition is, the more coalitions can potentially form. Coalitions are a normal part of organizational life. Even in a group with widely shared positive culture and values, people will group up and will discuss their needs and then will look for opportunities to try to negotiate and get what they want. Our job as political leaders at all levels, lower levels all the way to the top of the organization, is to remember that coalitions can often lead to conflict. It's a natural part of the process. And because of this conflict, we need to understand and use power effectively to help us navigate problems and arrive at solutions through bargaining, negotiating, and even healthy jockeying for position among various stakeholders so that we can get things done within the context of limited resources. So how we do this, how we engage in conflict through negotiation and bargaining and the ethical use of power is the central focus of the political frame. So effective leaders don't deny this conflict. They recognize it. They develop strategy and tactics for dealing with it. And even though this is a weird picture, for me it's helpful. It shows that conflict can be kind of a good tension. So like in a dance, partners sort of need to play off each other and give and take and respond to each other back and forth. And sometimes even in couples dancing, push back and forth and resist and give in order to make the dance work and actually look fluid. So hopefully you bared with me on that example and you see what I mean. The political frame can be a positive tension that can actually lead to enhanced and even beautiful accomplishment of goals. All right, fine. So the political frame is kind of like a dance, Sean. I get it, right? So how can I use skills in the political frame to actually advocate for people and accomplish goals? Cover 4 things that your chapter will say that effective political leaders do in order to lead well. So I give 2 pictures here, one of Martin Luther King Jr. and the other of the U.S. Women's 2019 soccer team, just as examples of operating well in the political frame. And that means avoiding either naivety or cynicism. So like your book would say, and most of us realize, naivety from a political perspective would be kind of ignoring the idea of power struggles in the first place. We call it burying our head in the sand and just sort of assuming that it doesn't exist because it's easier just to operate on the assumption that people are essentially good and they won't actively take away resources or hog them all for themselves. And naivety would say that people are essentially thinking of you and your needs rather than a cynical view that would say people are always out to get you. You have to get what's yours, otherwise someone will take it away. Nick, operating in the political frame, wouldn't think of service to their fellow teammates at all, but would rather think of self-interest alone and might even protest and maybe not even join a team in order to make a statement about what their needs are. So hold those 2 examples in your head, Martin Luther King and women's soccer, as we talk through the 4 steps that effective political leaders should take. Step 1 of effective political leadership is to be clear about and understand the difference between my needs and my wants and the team's needs and the team's wants. Once the leader is clear on what the team or the organization needs, then they take the next step of mapping the terrain or the environment in which they exist. Before they make a plan, they need to understand the political environment in which they exist. And the better able they are to understand the politics of the moment, the more effective their actions and their strategy will be once they decide to move. Then step 3, after they have strategy and after they've understood the political environment in which they want to act, then they employ the action plan. And they do that through building coalitions among key stakeholders, the influencers and the people that they need to convince in order to accomplish and advocate well. They need to start building those links. So once they've identified who the stakeholders are and strategy for building the links, they actually build those relationships through persuasion and negotiation, and I'll say coercion as well, although coercion is a dangerous territory within the political frame. I would say tread lightly, operate very carefully, knowing that coercion especially can, if used poorly, can break down relationships, and then trust can be very hard to restore once those relationships are weakened in any way. Step one is setting the agenda, and it's all about getting our vision and values dialed in. It goes without saying, but we'll still say it. It makes no sense to advocate in a political environment if I'm not clear about what I want and what I need for the team and how I might get it. So in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., for example, the vision was social and racial justice under the existing laws in the United States in the time of the 1960s. And his primary value was nonviolent protest. So then based on that vision and those values, King's really good, effective strategy was to gather people together through nonviolent demonstration to communicate to the leaders as well as the common American the disconnect, the horrible disconnect between the laws that we had that would protect all citizens and the actual systems that were in place at the time that promoted or at least perpetuated institutional racism. And of course, maybe most politically effective of all, King was a master communicator who could communicate that vision regularly, and his timing in communicating, for example, the I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Washington, or the National Mall, I should say, he could communicate the vision regularly and effectively in order to accomplish what needed to happen. All right, the second step in effective political leadership is probably the most difficult of all, and it's often the one that is either skipped altogether or is rushed through way too quickly by most of us when we're trying to lead in the political frame. It's called mapping the terrain, or understanding the political turf before I act or even speak in favor of whatever I'm negotiating or advocating for. And this is largely because of what we talked about way back in week one, the first night of class, when we said that organizational life is confusing, it's complex, it's deceptive, and it's ambiguous because people are all those things. So once we're clear on what our values are and what our strategy should be and what our vision is, we have to actually map the political terrain so that we know how to act. And by knowing how to act, I mean who has the power, who do we need to convince, what resistance do we need to overcome, who's on our side, who feels the same way we do. In essence, can we accomplish the very thing that we're trying to accomplish? And how easily can we accomplish it? We have to know who the players are, we have to know the level of power each of the players has and what their interests are and whether or not they align with our interests and needs. As we determine those things, take a look at these points here on this slide and use them as reminders for rules of operating. Years ago, there was this financial advising commercial, I think it was, and the commercial line, the tagline was basically, when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen. So the idea is people take their advice. This is John Maxwell, a leadership theorist, who said this, but the point is fantastic. Do you know who in the room, when you pitch your idea, who in the room that when they begin speaking, everyone in the room looks and listens? Obviously, the effective political leader needs to know who that person or who those people are and whether or not that person is you. And if it's not you, fine. Know who the person is, know who the people are, and be aware of what their interests are and whether or not they align with yours. And another really good thing to remember is how important is the thing that you're advocating for to you and your group. Keep this in mind. The words of Dean Smith, many of you will remember him as one of the winningest basketball coaches and kind of a legendary coach of North Carolina basketball. He says, if you treat every situation as a life and death matter, you'll die a lot of times. The idea being, when you're in the middle of negotiation, especially if it's in a meeting or with a group of people, emotions can come into play. We can get backed into a corner unnecessarily, and we can often view the situation as a matter of life and death when it's really not nearly that important. In short, I need to know how hard I'm willing to push in order to accomplish something, and when to back off and work on an exit strategy when it looks like I'm not going to be able to advocate as effectively as I wanted to. Here, I'm going to refer you to a quick example from your book. Take a look at it if you need, because I'll go quickly now, but take a look at it later. But it's a really good example of people trying to operate effectively in the political frame and thinking they have a good understanding of the political map of their organization, but missing reality and then potentially not getting what they need simply for missing how they might have acted more strategically. So the example is from a tech company where the techies or the IT geeks wanted to pitch an idea about buying some new technology and spending some money on it. And they mapped the terrain, so they thought, based on who had the power in the organization and whether or not those people either bought into the potential change that the techies wanted to make, they were pro-change, or they were opposed to change. And this is the map they came up with. In short, they thought those with power, high-level power, top management, were really pro-change and highly supportive of their idea. And those with mid-level power, themselves and middle managers, were neutral to in favor of the change. And those with a low amount of power, the frontline managers and officials, they were opposed to the change. But as you can see from this diagram, the techies felt like the top management and themselves would easily overcome any power struggle because they were very in favor of the techies' idea. But here was the reality. If someone could go back and perfectly diagnose the real political map, they would see that techies were sort of on an island here, and they were very supportive of the change, but other people were much less convinced. Those with the real power were in the middle in terms of supporting or opposing the change, and the middle managers and the frontline officials were opposed to the change. And then one more obvious thing, top management felt and even set up the decision to be one where people really shared power related to decision making. So the techies actually thought that top management had more power than they did when top management was giving everyone else equal power in the decision. Well, so what? What the techies failed to see was that each of these three parts of the organization, or each of those three coalitions, needed to be influenced at an equal level because they shared almost equal power. A made-up example, but proves a really good organizational point that often we as leaders think we understand the political terrain when it's more complex or maybe even more simple than we're giving it credit for, and we charge ahead with a strategy without fully considering what we're walking into. And I would say that the real hard work in the political frame is taking time to map the terrain, if you can. Sometimes life is chaotic and crazy and we don't have a whole lot of time to map it, but when you do, write it down, remember it, use it in your own writings. It's worth the time to slowly map the political terrain before you start to really try to advocate for those you lead. But once I feel like I really do understand the terrain and your team has really worked on understanding it, then we work to realign the political forces. How do we do that? We focus on key relationships, we network, and we build coalitions in order to influence the negotiation process. So we enter into step 3, principled negotiation through networking and building of coalitions in order to exercise influence. We identify the people that we need. Remember, we started this talk by saying people are interdependent and yet resources are scarce, and therefore there is conflict. It's natural, it's normal, and it's realistic to anticipate that conflict. Well, now effective political leadership is simply trying to anticipate Who can help us work through that conflict? Whose help do we need? Who can we influence to come over to our side, quote, where will the challenges be? And even who might oppose us outrightly? Because even the opposition isn't the enemy necessarily. Sometimes these are just people on the other side who will have to give up some resources, will have to voluntarily withhold something from themselves in order to give you what you want. So effective, ethical, political leaders, remember, see advocacy as service. And so you as the political leader, if you know someone is going to have to effectively lose or give up resources in order for you to get what you want, then you can find a way to serve them even as you seek to influence them. So bargaining and negotiation, we could spend a lot of time on this since a lot has been written on strategy and the psychology of this. But for now, I would say it's the job of the effective political leader to engage in principled bargaining. Essentially, do what mom told you in terms of operating with people. Treat them with respect. Separate the person from the particular problem that you're working on in the moment. This can be easy when you get along with the people you're negotiating with, but many of you know there's personality conflict, there's history. People are complex, so sometimes it is difficult to separate the person from the problem, and yet it's the job of the servant political leader to get over themselves, to be clear on what they need, and then to keep your interests in mind and the needs of your group at the front of your mind rather than defending your own reputation or political history in the moment. Don't get locked into one solution only attitude. It's not necessary an if I win, you have to lose scenario. And insist on objective criteria for fairness. So the example of U.S. women's soccer, the U.S. women tried to negotiate first with the U.S. Soccer Federation and indirectly with FIFA, but once negotiations broke down, then they pursued a lawsuit, but only based on violation of federal contract law, Title VII, I think, and gender discrimination or Title IX law. So the lawsuit wasn't directly related to women's soccer athletes saying we must be paid exactly what our counterpart male soccer players were paid, but that our rights should be defended and guaranteed as much as the men's rights related to contract law and compensation and benefits related to our soccer. All right, and finally, I said I'd be quick on step 4 there, so let's move on. The effective political leader also, and finally, needs to remember what type of power they have and possess in order to negotiate. So the last 2 slides get you to think about the types of power you have in your current position, as well as the types that other managers that you know and have worked with have. Just think through the types and the levels of power you have and the levels of influence you can potentially have as you seek to negotiate and advocate and to be an effective political leader in your context. Because you'll need to understand and use these sources of power effectively and ethically as you practice and seek to view reality from the political perspective, and more importantly, as you seek to serve and influence people by solving problems in this frame. That's all for the introduction to the political frame. Thanks for listening in, and please reach out to me with any questions that you have. Thanks. Have a great day.